Hi friends, I hope everyone's doing well. Before we get started, I wanted to quickly share the backstory for this video. I have a list of design ideas, techniques, and art supplies that I want to try out. I usually film when I play, so I have a record of it as a reference. I thought it might be interesting to share some of these sessions on my channel. A reminder that the sessions will have a mix of narration and music, so let's get started. For this first play session, I had the idea to create two separate painted ground layers, then splice them together to create the substrate. This will be the first or ground layer for a collage. I wanted to see how this technique would work in my collage practice. I chose paint colors and patterns that are similar. This first painted ground will be a simple plaid using orange and yellow paint. The uneven lines that make up the plaid were made with a size 6 round brush. I prefer creating uneven lines because I think it gives more character to the pattern. You'll see that when one side of the brush is low on paint, I flip the brush around to the other side where there's still some paint left. I want to unload as much paint as possible from the brush to the paper before dipping it back into the paint. Also, I like using a ruler as a loose guide when painting lines. I want the lines to be uneven, but I want those lines to be somewhat straight across the surface. If I didn't use a ruler, I would gravitate to painting at an angle. That would be okay if I wanted the lines going in that direction. I cut out some of the footage of me painting the lines because it can be monotonous to watch. After I painted the orange horizontal lines, I flipped the paper from vertical to horizontal orientation to paint the yellow lines. I find it easier to paint lines from left to right rather than top to bottom. The yellow lines will be vertical on the finished pattern. I used orange and red paint for this next paper. I positioned the paper horizontally to easily paint the stripes that will be in a vertical orientation. Again, I used a ruler as a loose guide. This ground will have two different size stripes using the two different colors. The first stripe will be thick, so I'm using a 3/4 inch flat brush. I'll use the size 6 round brush again to paint the thin red stripes in between the thick orange stripes. In this section, I didn't realize until editing the video that the papers were not positioned in the center of the frame. I think you'll be able to see how I splice these papers together anyway. There are two ways to do this step. First is to line up the two papers exactly on top of each other, tape, then cut. Second is what I decided to do. I put two papers on top of each other, lined up the sides, but left about an inch overhang in the length. I use this positioning because I haven't spliced two papers together in a very long time. I wanted to have enough length at the end to account for any cutting errors. Since this is a play session, I wanted to use this method. If I do this technique again, I'll use the first cutting method. I use washi tape on the back to secure the top section, then use a few smaller pieces of it to secure the sides, leaving the bottom section untaped. I decided on splicing the papers together with a slight diagonal cut. It felt awkward to make this cut with the papers vertically, so I repositioned them. When cutting with an X-Acto knife, I was taught to exhale when cutting the paper. Breathe in before cutting, then exhale while cutting. It sounds odd, but it does help to get a straight edge. Also, make sure you have a new blade. I prefer to use metal rulers to cut a straight edge. Metal rulers are sturdier than plastic rulers, so they're less likely to move when cutting. Also, the metal edge is more precise. I only added a few pieces of the washi tape to join the two papers together. I'll be collaging on top of the diagonal cut, so the two papers will be secured. I like to line up the two papers from the front so I can make sure the pattern papers are positioned correctly. Here are the papers I pulled for collaging. Per usual, I pulled more papers than needed, so I have options. I'm using matte Mod Podge to glue the papers. This step will be done off camera to save time. I'm going to add music while you watch me create this diagonal composition collage. I'll come back at the end of this section so we can discuss the finished collage. Here's the finished collage. I like how the collage turned out. It has all three values. I like the contrast of the red, orange, and yellow ground layer against the blue and green diagonal collage section. Splicing the two pattern papers together worked well. I can see using this technique for future collages. Let's go on to the next play session. For this play session, I'm using 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. I'm playing with the pour technique, but instead of using acrylic paint, I'm using watercolor. I want to get a splatter effect. I unsuccessfully tried this technique in another video. A viewer named Brenda left a comment on that video suggesting that I use a straw to get the splatter effect, so that's what I'll be trying in this session. I wanted the watercolor in a general area on the paper. That's why I placed the paper on top of the cup, then turned the paper over to let the watercolor pour out. I tried blowing through the straw with different amounts of strength to control the direction of the watercolor splatter. It was a trial and error process. This part of the video is shaky at times. As you'll see, when I move around the table, I bumped into it. I tried to fix it in post. That fix caused other issues with the video, so I left in the shaky sections. If I film this technique in the future, I would carefully move the paper around instead of me moving around the table. There are timestamps if you want to skip this section. At first, I wanted the watercolor to dry on its own, but it was taking too long. I still had two more colors that I wanted to add to this paper. I couldn't use a hairdryer for obvious reasons. I decided to gently use a paper towel to pull up the excess watercolor. I did the same technique for the next two colors. All in all, using the straw gave me the splatter look that I wanted. The reason I tried this technique is that I want to use it as a ground layer for collaging. In the next section, I'll be creating a radiated composition on top of this ground layer. Here are the papers I pulled. I wanted papers that lean towards a muted color palette to complement the muted watercolor splatters on the ground. I have videos discussing different compositions such as radiating. I'll link both videos in the description area. I'm not going to narrate too much in this section. I do want to mention a few things before I add music. In all my collages, I strive to have all three values represented, light, mid, and dark. So I'll be thinking about that when selecting paper for the collage elements. Since the splatter ground is a strong element, I'm not going to cover too much of it with paper. The shapes of the radiating elements will be on the thinner side. I'll add music at this point and come back at the end to discuss the finished collage. Here's the finished collage. I'm happy that I tried the watercolor pour technique again. The results were much better than before. I like the sparse radiating design of the collage elements on top of the splatters. I'm glad I went back in at the end and added the dark green element in the upper left corner. It balanced the collage. I hope you enjoyed and learned something from this video. I encourage you to take time to play, explore different techniques, design ideas, and art supplies. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you in my next video. Take care.